And I said, "Where is my mother?" And he turns to me as coldly and as just matter-of-factly as one can speak. And he says, "Well, Mommy took a little vacation, Collier." And right then I knew.
Hello and welcome to the Daily Helping with Dr. Richard Schuster. Food for the brain, knowledge from the experts, tools to win at life. I'm your host, Dr. Richard. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, and whatever you do, this is the show that is going to help you become the best version of yourself. Each episode, you will hear from some of the most amazing, talented, and successful people on the planet who followed their passions and strive to help others. Join our movement to get 1 million people each day to commit acts of kindness for others. Together, we're going to make the world a better place. Are you ready? Because it's time for your Daily Helping. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Daily Helping Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Richard, and our guest today is one of the most resilient and amazing people you will ever hear in your entire life. At just 11 years old, Collier Landry faced an unimaginable tragedy. His father murdered his mother. Refusing to stay silent, he found the courage to gather evidence and testify against his own father, ensuring justice was served. Abandoned by his family in the aftermath, Collier was forced to develop grit and self-reliance at a young age, laying the foundation for a life defined by resilience and forward movement. Now a filmmaker, podcaster, and speaker, Collier transforms his experience into powerful conversations on perseverance, self-determination, and healing. His acclaimed documentary, A Murder in Mansfield, directed by Oscar winner Barbara Kopple, captures his journey of confronting the past, while his podcast, The Collier Landry Show, explores overcoming adversity, mental health, and reclaiming one's power. His latest podcast, Finding Mom's Killer, launched in March of 2025 in collaboration with Sony Music. Collier's story proves that while trauma may shape us, it does not have to define us. His insights on grit and resilience make him a sought-after media guest, challenging audiences to break free from their past and build a future on their own terms. Collier, welcome to Daily Helping Podcast. It is an honor to have you with us today.
Dr. Richard, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We're excited you are. I know your story is so powerful, and I know you've told it in a lot of places. You know, this is kind of interesting in terms of what I usually do, because I usually ask my guests to kind of put in their time machine hat and talk to us about what put them on the journey today. In your case, you didn't have a choice. It was forced upon you. So if you're open to going back and discussing with kind of some detail and give us context, let's talk about what happened.
Well, my name is Collier Landry. I'm from Mansfield, Ohio. Currently live in Los Angeles. But, you know, when I think back to how everything unfolded, and, you know, I think that we all believe that our childhood experience is like just totally normal, right? And we grow up with, you know, like, okay, I have a mother and father that love me. I have a great life. I have a roof over my head. I have food on the table, that type of thing. You know, we never are privy to the sort of, I don't know if I would call it insidious, but maybe the underbelly of the human dynamic that exists in marriages and exists in, you know, coexisting as a family and things of that nature. But I was born in Philadelphia. I moved to a small town, a naval base in Virginia when I was just a baby, and spent the first 4.5 years of my life there. And, you know, I grew up on a naval base those 4.5 years, and I used to watch airplanes land in the backyard. And I knew my father had something to do with the Navy, and I knew that we were involved somehow. And my father was a doctor. And I never really thought much of, you know, I was young anyways, but I never really thought much of what my life was at that time. And then my father got a job offer from a hospital in Mansfield, Ohio. And we ended up moving there. I was about 5.5 years old when we moved to Mansfield. And I would say that at that time, and it could be just because I was, you know, a young boy, very young boy, growing into an older boy, I started to notice things in my family dynamic that didn't sit right with me, right? My father, you know, was very abusive to my mother and I, verbally, physically, mentally. And I kind of grew up with this notion that my father was a workaholic, which he was, But my father was, when he was around, it was like walking on eggshells. And when he wasn't around, it was like I could have a breath. And I was, with my mother, who I loved very dearly, who was the most important person in my life and like a best friend. Obviously, I was her constant companion and she was mine. And we had a very, I guess, typical mother-son relationship. But my father, he was a rageaholic. He would flip on the turn of a dime. I can remember one time we were making breakfast in the kitchen one Saturday morning, and I dropped an egg on the floor, and my father, he was apoplectic, and just tirade after tirade, and basically made my mother get down on her knees and beg for my life so he didn't kill me for dropping an egg. And this was a regular sort of occurrence in our household. And so I guess in a lot of ways, I grew up walking on eggshells. There was a lot of fight or flight, I suppose, that surrounded that. And, I didn't know at the time, but the dynamic between my mother and father is my father was a chronic womanizer and had multiple relationships outside the marriage. And it got even worse when we went to Ohio. And so he was in charge of this hospital called People's Hospital, and he was there. And he was asked to leave after about 7 or 8 months. About a year and a half to a year and 8 months. He was asked to leave because he had something, and I find this all out later, of course, but he had something like 192 sexual harassment complaints against him from staff, from patients, from vendors that had come in. I mean, it was across the gamut, lots of nurses. That's quite a lot to rack up in a short period of time. And my father had entered private practice after being dismissed by the hospital. Again, I wasn't aware of this because I'm a child, right? But I would see two different sort of states with my father. One would be when he was in the home, it was this, let's not set him off. When I would go with him and he would make his rounds with his patients, because that was one of the things I would love to do, is to go to the hospital with him, he see his patients, or go to their houses, he'd give care to them. I come and sing, I play a little harmonica, I tap dance around, and that would be my thing that I would do, right? And I saw the way that my father interacted with others, and I thought, God, why can't my father be that way with my mother and I? Where is this caring and compassionate man in our home, And I remember my mother used to say things to me like, he would, storm out in some sort of tantrum or whatever. And my mother would be like, your father loves you in his own sick, weird way. And I never saw my parents' normal sort of dynamic in a relationship. I knew that my father was always sleeping on the couch, but it was always under the guise of, well, he was working late and he had to get up early, or he would get paged in the middle of the night, so he would have to whisk off and go deal with a patient. So therefore, he wasn't able to, he didn't want to disturb us and wake us up, right? And I remember at the time when we moved to Mansfield, I met other kids whose dads were, high-end professionals, doctors, lawyers, what have you, right? Accountants, things like that. And they all had these stories of coming from, well, my father, and mother are divorced. They're, splitting weekends. They are meeting their father's girlfriend, or their mother saying all these bad things about their dad. And sort of this, I saw the world that they lived in. And I used to say to myself, well, even though I know things, because I'm starting to understand that things aren't really right in the home. Even though things aren't right, at least I have a family that is together, and I don't have to worry about that, right? I don't have to worry. I have a mommy and daddy that live with me. We have a house we live in. It was a very small house, very modest house, and we live in this house, and I have a roof over my head. I go to school. I have friends, and I'm happy with that. Like, because I could see the way my other friends were impacted by divorce. So around like 1988, 1989, and my mother actually decides that she wants to adopt a little girl from Taiwan because she wanted another child. And unbeknownst to me is the dynamic of their marriage, which again, I just still do not know that my father is a chronic, womanizer and things of that nature. Her and I were supposed to go to Taiwan together. I was going to go see Taiwan. We were going to meet the family. We were going to be there for like 2 weeks, right? It'd be an amazing trip. When I was a child, I was really sickened with asthma. And I ended up getting a really bad asthma attack and bronchitis like right before we were supposed to leave. So I couldn't go because I probably would have died. That was a really defining moment with my father and I, because when you're left alone with your abuser and your protector is 8,000 miles away, things get gnarly. And during that 2 week time span, my father tortured the hell out of me. I was 11 years old at this time. And I was a chubby little kid because I was always on steroids for asthma and things like that. I had asthma since I was starting around 9 years old. And my father started calling me like a stupid little fat boy. My father, would call me, a fat it, and my mother's turning me into a fat it, and all these just really derogatory things. And I had heard this stuff from my father before too, because we would play catch in the yard, and he would try to throw a baseball at my head or at my balls, to try to injure me, to make me more of a man. He would push me around when be shooting baskets with him, and he tried to, push me to the ground, and, oh, this is what you get. And, I never really quite understood that aggression from him. But when I was left alone for those 2 weeks, I saw the real monster that he was. And I remember him, I think he was watching like Commando or something on the couch. Yeah, it was Commando. And I was playing a video game on my computer, and I unplugged the speakers in the back of the computer because I didn't want the noise from the speakers to interfere with his movie, that he was watching. And he comes in my mother's office where the computer was, and he says, "Why is there no noise? Why is there no sound coming out of the speakers?" And I said, "Well, I unplugged them." And he got into a tirade, and he grabbed the speaker jack and he shoved it in my face. He's like, "Yo, don't ever fucking do this, blah, blah." And he took all these books off the bookshelves and boxes for games and just started throwing things at me and chasing me around the house and saying, "What are you?" and making me respond, "I'm a stupid little fat boy." And he would chase me around and throw tirades and made me like clean the house and all this. And it was just, this went on. And then he would apologize. And it would be like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation. And of course, I'm just like, this guy's a monster. Like, what, And I already saw spurts of this, but I never had to live with it in a sequence that just continued to happen, over and over again. Because again, my mother's not around, right? She's halfway across the planet. So my mother returns, and I can remember, so this is, again, 1989. I'm 11 years old, and my father takes me to a Memorial Day barbecue. Because sometimes I would go off with him, like I said, go off to see his patients and whatnot. He was going to a patient's house for Memorial Day, and he took me with him. And it was this barbecue, and it was really cool and fun. It was a place that I'd never really had been to. People playing, drinking beer and hanging out, cooking the hog, and playing volleyball in the backyard and racing quads and things. And he introduces me to this woman whose house it was. Her name was Sherry Campbell. And I said, "Oh, okay." And he told me that this was a patient of his. And she was a young woman in her like late 20s probably. And I didn't really pay any mind of it. And actually, I liked Sherry. She let me get on the quad with her, and I'm racing around with her on the quad. She almost fell off the back as I was going over a bridge. It would have been terrible. That would have changed the whole arc of the story, to be honest with you. But yeah, and later on that night, I was like skipping stones on the little lake that was out in front of the house. And I look back, and I'm walking around, and my father's got his arm around her. We leave, and I kind of noted that. I was like, okay, that's kind of weird, but whatever. It didn't look romantic, but it looked very comforting. And I asked my father, I said, "Well, what was going on with her?" And he told me, he goes, "Oh, well, she's terminally ill, and so Daddy was comforting her." And I was like, "Oh, that's terrible, right?" But I didn't pay any mind to that. I just didn't even think about it. About a month later, it's Father's Day, and my father says, "Hey, I'm going to go to my office, and I'm going to get a suntan. I want you to come with me." And I was, okay. And this is the late 80s, so everybody's getting tans, and there's tanning salons everywhere and things like that. And we go over to his office, we stop at the tanning salon, and out comes Sherry again with 2 radio-controlled cars. And "Happy Father's Day, you guys," and blah, blah, blah. And I noticed on her hand, she has a ring that was very unique. And I said, "Oh, my mother has a ring like that." And she just kind of giggles and looks at my father and doesn't say anything. And I was like, okay, so I start playing with radio-controlled cars. I'm playing with the radio-controlled car, and I look up, and my father is full-on kissing this woman, making out. And I had never seen that before outside of movies. I had never seen my father behave that way with my mother or anything, but I was like, okay, something's up. And all I can think about is when my friends at school who had parents who were divorced, they were talking about like the moment that they knew that their dad was cheating. And I was like, oh my God, this is that moment. Ding, ding, ding. You are in this moment. And I don't know what to think. But again, I'm afraid of my father too, as I've explained. And by this time, my sister had been brought to the United States, and she was adopted by our family, and she was living in the house. So, but my father gets back in the car, And we're leaving, and he says, okay, and my nickname is Bumper, and he calls me ever since I was a kid. My mom did as well. He says, Bump, I don't want you to say anything to your mother about this. This will be our little secret. He never asked me to lie to my mother. And he said, don't say anything to her. Tell her that Daddy bought you the remote control cars as a present for getting good grades. I said, okay, what I'm going to say. I'm terrified of this man. I'm not going to be like, no, I think you're having an affair, Dad. I'm I'm like, okay, sure. So we go out to dinner that night, and I'm kind of really sick because I'm sickened I told the lie to my mother. And the next day I'm playing with the radio control car. My father's gone, and my mother's sitting on the porch, and I'm so overwhelmed by guilt. I come in and I say, Mommy, I said, I need to talk to you. I think Daddy is having an affair. And I told her all about Sherry, how I had met her the month before, how yesterday, I had seen her on Father's Day. They were kissing. She had the ring on that I was certain was my mother's, and all this stuff, right? And my mother just very calmly looked at me. She was not pleased that I lied to her, but she understood because my father asked me to. And then she went on in the kitchen and got on the phone and just started yelling. And I knew at that moment, like, okay, I'm, a kid who's going to go through a divorce. Like, this is happening. So I would say the next 6 months, this is June, obviously, of 1989, I would say that the tensions really rose in the household big time. And then the cat was out of the bag. My father had a girlfriend. And unbeknownst to me at the time, she was pregnant, by the way. It's interesting as I'm playing all this back to and thinking about the behaviors. My father is up for parole here this year. And so I think about this and what I have to say to the parole board. So that's just sort of an aside that I'm thinking about as I'm reliving this. But my father, I guess he didn't really want to accept the divorce, even though he was technically apparently engaged to Sherry. And I remember anytime he would take me, to go run an errand or whatever, because we were sort of trying out like the joint custody thing. So now you're going to go with your father and spend time with him. Now you're going to spend time with your mother. And it would always be super acrimonious with my father and just weird. And we would run into Sherry randomly at like a Kmart or something. And he'd be like, oh, look who's here. It's Sherry. And I even said this in the trial. And he would tell me stories of how he's got a new life with a new family. And he's going to give them the life because my mother has decided to divorce him and destroy our life. So she's the one to blame. And he's going to make it so I never go to college. So we have no money. So we're living on the street. So my sister's going to be sent back to China. All these things. He's going to ruin our lives because my mother wants a divorce. And so that's what I lived with. And hearing how Sherry's kids are the greatest in the world. You're not going to have anything. I'm going to make sure of it. And I think my mother put up like a really good fight with my father, and he would, he was not living with us. He would come in randomly, to take me for something, or he would, come to pick up some clothes or whatever. But I'm just assuming he was basically living with Sherry at that time. Around Thanksgiving of 1989, I could tell that things were really starting to wear on my mom, and she picks me up from school, and we're driving to Bob Evans to get dinner because she didn't feel like cooking. And for anyone that is in the Midwest, you know what a Bob Evans is. And she says to me, we're driving in this stretch in Mansfield called Hanley Road to get to the Bob Evans. And then she says to me, she goes, Collier, I want you to know that I would never leave you. And I was like, of course, Mom. Yeah, of course. And she goes, I want you to know that if something ever happens to me and I disappear, your father probably had me killed. And I was like, wait, what? And she started talking about how my father had mafia connections and how my father, could wipe her out and how my father could, has all these mafia connections, has a way to dispose of her and all. And I'm just like, Mommy, that's not going to happen. I remember that year Batman came out, and I probably saw that in the theater with her a dozen times at least. And I was like, I'm going to be her Caped Crusader and protect her. I was like, I'm going to be like Batman, Mommy. I will protect you, So my mother and I have this conversation, and I'm just like, that'll just never happen. But again, my mother's in like a really low state. Like I haven't seen her this low before because my mother was I've spent all this time talking about my mother. My mother was a beautiful, open, kind, caring, generous, perpetually optimistic and happy person. That's where I get all of my personality from, I'd say. She loved everyone. She loved helping people. She was so generous. And she had this spirit about her and this smile that would just light up a room. And she had a way of putting everyone else at ease, putting everyone else's needs first before her own. And she was like that generous of a person. So to see my mother in a way where she has been just dragged through it. It was heartbreaking. And again, every time I'm with my father, he's reminding me on how he's going to make our life a living hell because of my mother and her decision to divorce him. Never mind, he has a girlfriend. And how he's going to live with her. He's moving his practice to Erie, Pennsylvania, and all these things, right? They're going to have this amazing life together, him and her and the kids. So my grandmother, who is my father's mother on the Italian side, she was supposed to come to us for Christmas, but she ended up getting pneumonia, but she didn't show up until New Year's Eve, and or right before New Year's. And, that Christmas was really not like a great Christmas. Obviously, there's a lot of tension in the household, and my father, I don't even think, was there. We knew he was off with his girlfriend and things like that, right? So my grandmother comes. This is on December 30th, 1989. And my grandmother shows up later that night with my father because she was going to come stay with us for New Year's. And my mother and my father's mother, my grandmother, had a very close relationship. They were almost like sisters or like mother and daughter, because my mother wasn't particularly close with her mother, who both of her parents had passed away a couple of years earlier. My father's father had passed away about a year and a half earlier from there. And so she was my last surviving grandparent. And my mother and her they just were like two peas in a pod. And my grandmother arrives, and my mother was on the phone with one of her best friends, and she had said, it's according to her witness statement, she said, well, he showed up with his mother, so he can't kill me tonight. My mother sort of had a very sardonic sense of humor. That was one of the things I always loved about her, which has definitely translated to me as an adult. But she used to say famous last words. And she couldn't have been more accurate. So my grandmother comes, I show her some of the stuff that Santa Claus, because I still believed in Santa Claus at that time, had brought me for Christmas, and my sister, and I kiss my grandmother goodnight, and I go and kiss my mother goodnight, and I love you, mommy, and I go to sleep. Around 3:15 in the morning, I'm awoken, but what I'm pretty sure is a scream. And then I hear two loud thuds separated by about a minute apart. And I'll later describe this as the sound of a body hitting a wall. It was a whoom, it was a boom. And I'm laying in my bed, and of course, all that's really replaying in my head is the conversation I had a couple of months prior with my mother. I'm laying there, and I'm having this moment, and I'm looking at my Batman clock on the wall, and now by that time it's about 3:18 a.m. And I'm trying to sort of rationalize in my head, okay, so do I get up and go to look at what happens when I'm an asthmatic little kid? I'm thinking, if this is my father is 6'3", 230 pounds. I'm a chubby asthmatic little kid. And what is going on? And as I'm starting to maybe think, do I need to get, what am I going to do? I hear footsteps come down the hall. And as a child, I always slept with my door open. And I'm laying in my bed, and I'm looking at the clock, and I'm looking at this mural I had on a wall of a sailboat. And out of my peripheral vision, I can see the doorway. And I see two shoes land in the doorway, 2 feet. And I recognize those as my father's shoes. And everything inside me in that moment is screaming, don't look up. Because I am absolutely convinced that if I had just turned my head and looked up, that I would not be sitting here today. It would be nothing to say that she left with the kid in the middle of the night and make the hole a little bit bigger. So the feet leave the doorway, and I manage to go back to sleep, and I wake up a few hours later. The sun is out, and I rush straight to my mother's bedroom. And what was sort of odd is that my mother always made her bed when she got up in the morning, and the bed wasn't made, and the sheets were in this state of disarray, and I was looking through the sheets for blood. And I come downstairs, obviously my mother's not there. I come downstairs, and my father is sitting on the couch with a towel wrapped around his waist, like he just got out of the shower. And I said to him, where is my mother? And he doesn't say anything. And I said, where is my mother? And he turns to me as coldly and as just matter-of-factly as one can speak. And he says, well, mommy took a little vacation, Collier. And right then I knew. And I wasn't 100% sure that he killed her, but I definitely know he did something to her. And my father then launches into this diatribe of how My mother came down in the middle of the night while he was sleeping on the couch. They got into a huge argument. She started throwing things at him, credit cards. She threw her purse at him. And I said to him, I said, well, what about the thud that I heard on the wall? Like, what did I hear? What did he goes, oh, that was your mother when she threw her purse at me. Like, yeah, that doesn't sound like a purse. And my mother was no like, decathlete. And he's just going on and on. And by this time, my grandmother had come into the living room and she's wondering what's happened and where my mother is. And he starts going into all this, telling her the story. And I'm just like, buddy, like this didn't happen. Like I know what I heard. And I know I would have heard them arguing and screaming. Because between those two thuds, I could hear my father just murmuring in her bedroom. That was what was in the silence between the thuds. And so I would have heard an argument. I would have heard an interaction. And my father is explaining to us like how we're not going to call, or we're not going to call the police. We're not going to call the FBI. And I remember when he said we're not going to call the FBI, I remember thinking to myself, well, we live in a really small town in Ohio. Why would the FBI be getting involved? And I just don't believe this man. My father ends up leaving. And my grandmother's like, well, you've heard your father. We're not going to call anybody. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to alert the authorities. And I was like, yeah, that's not happening. So one of the things that I had done after that conversation with my mother in November about her, if something had happened to her, my father probably had her killed. I, on a piece of paper, wrote down all my mother's friends' names and phone numbers. And I hid it in this stuffed Garfield I had in my room, in a little hat that this Garfield had. And my grandmother starts like making breakfast and dealing with my sister. And I grab the cordless phone that my mom had just gotten. And I go upstairs and I grab that list and I lock myself into my mother's bathroom and I start calling everybody on the list. And I tell them exactly what happened. And I said, I'm not allowed to call the police, but you need to call the police. And my grandmother catches me, by the way. A couple hours later, 2 uniformed officers show up at the house. And my father's gone for the day, by the way. And my grandmother's apoplectic when they show up. And, you call the police. I was like, I didn't call the police. I didn't call the police. I didn't call anybody, And we're walking around the house and my grandmother's like helicoptering. So I can never get one of the officers alone to like just say, look, this is what's going on. This is what's happened. But we go upstairs and one officer goes into my mom's bedroom. The other one goes to my sister's bedroom, which is right next door. And I just kind of dart in there and I say, look, and my mother used to say she could never trust my father as far as she could throw him. So I said, look, my mom used to say, I don't trust my father as far as I could throw him. And I said, he's done something to her. And the cop is just looking at me like, kid, you've got a very vibrant imagination. And they leave. And a day goes by. My father comes home that night and we're having dinner. This is New Year's Eve now. And my father's telling, speculating like, where could my mother have gone and what she was having for dinner. And I can't believe she left us in such a state. It was so selfish of her. And these conversations would carry on for quite a while. And the next day, nothing happens. And I grab the phone. I lock myself in the bathroom. I call the friends and I say, what happened? They go, well, we filed a missing persons report. And I'm like, she's not missing. Like he's done something to her. Nothing happens. And later on that night, Sherry Campbell comes over and she has cooked us pork and sauerkraut dinner. Now, this is my father's girlfriend that he's telling me he's starting a new life with and going to basically put me on the street, my mother and I on the street, and my sister on the street for. And she's come over to bring us pork roast for New Year's. And I'm like, why is this woman in our house? I'm thinking to myself, when my mom's gone, this is insane. So I'm not pleased about that. And again, my father, and they're weirdly sort of not discussing my mother at this time, but whatever happens, I go to bed and the next morning is just January 2nd and the doorbell rings and a detective by the name of Lieutenant David Messmore, who was a detective at the Mansfield Police Department, had seen the missing persons report. It's a sleepy small town in Ohio. Not much goes on around New Year's. And he was just kind of like, oh, a doctor's wife goes missing on New Year's. This is interesting, and just kind of came to ask some questions. Again, my grandmother is apoplectic, goes and says, I'm going to call my son. He's a doctor, bah, bah, bah. And this time, David already charmed his way into our house, right? And my mother as a child used to ride the carousel horses in Philadelphia. And she'd always tell me about that experience that The idea, my mother loved carousels. You would ride around the carousel and you would try to grab the brass ring to win the prize. That was the goal. And my mother would tell me, grab the brass ring in life, Collier. And I knew right then when my grandmother had left me alone to go use the phone, left me with a police detective, that this was like that moment to grab the brass ring. And I said to Dave, I directed his attention to me. I said, look, my mother would never leave me. My father's done something to her. I go to school tomorrow. Give me your card. I'll contact you. I'll tell you everything. And he's not looking at me like the other cops looked at me like, kid, yeah, you got a vivid imagination. He's like, because he's a detective, right? Okay. This is interesting. Like, kid's pretty adamant here, pretty convincing. So again, Dave leaves. My grandmother comes back and says, you need to get out of the house. He goes, okay, I'll come back and talk to the doctor. He came back that night. My father wouldn't speak to him. And my father had now, at this time, had started bringing his divorce attorney over. And so the attorney said, no, we're not talking. We don't want to talk to the police. The next morning I go to school. First thing I do, go to the principal's office, call this guy, Dave Messmore, Mansfield Police Department, get him down here. I want to talk to him. Dave Messmore comes down, and I don't know if it was 2 or 3 hours, but I lay out the entirety. And as anyone who's listening to this podcast knows, brevity is not my specialty, so you can only imagine what an 11-year-old child is telling this police detective. But I lay out the entirety of my mother and father's relationship and the girlfriend, Sherry Campbell, all these things. And I say to him, I'm like, look, when I go home tonight, because my father won't be home, while my grandmother's downstairs making dinner or dealing with my sister, I am going to go upstairs and pull out the bookshelf out of the wall where the crawl space is. And I knew about the crawl space because that's where my mom used to hide presents if she ever needed to hide presents. And pull the bookcase out of the wall and look at the crawl space for my mother's body. And I knew where those 2 places were in the house. And I said, I'm going to start looking. I'm going to look for her purse because she never would have left the house if she didn't have this one purse. I'm going to look for this one purse she never would have left with or whatever. I'm going to start gathering clues. And Dave is just kind of looking at me like, this kid. And that's what I did. Obviously did not find the body, but I started gathering evidence against my father. And my father came home, and again, we would have dinner, and he would be sitting down there saying, I wonder where mommy is tonight, what she's eating for dinner. I wonder where she is, where she's staying, if she's in a nice hotel. I just can't believe she's left our family in such a state like this. She's just left us with nothing. And again, Dave Messmore shows up that night to talk to my father. And this time, I've talked to him, and this is sort of how the bond between Dave Messmore and I built, because he's showing up to the house after having me talk to him at school to talk to my father. But he's not saying that. Like, there's this trust that has been built in us from Jump Street that I'm trusting you to not say, well, I talked to your son today at school and he told me this. And he's trusting me not to say anything to my father that, hey, I've been talking to a police detective who's going to, I'm giving him information, right? So every time I'm seeing Dave, I see Dave at the door and we're like looking at each other and my father's there. And this went on for weeks. But every single night, my father would come home. He'd have his divorce attorney show up after dinner, and Dave Messmore would show up wanting to talk to him. He was very persistent. And every day I go to school, I'd be calling Dave. I wasn't focusing on schoolwork. I was focusing on finding my mother and what happened to her. And it was about 2 weeks into this is mid-January 1990, where my father, and meanwhile, I'm noticing things with my father when he comes home. He had bruises all over his arm one time. Then the next time he had all these cuts on his hands. My father always had these really well-manicured hands. He had cuts all over his hand. And then his back and his shoulders were really sore. And he asked me to rub Bengay on his shoulders because he said he was moving boxes. So I was like, okay. But all of this, I was telling Dave Messmore. And again, every night having the same conversation. Mommy's left us in such a state. I wonder where she could be. Oh, maybe she's in Toronto. Maybe she's here. Oh, I would suggest someplace. Oh, maybe she's there, Collier. That's a great idea. It's insane. But mid-January 1990, my father says to me, he goes, hey, I'm going to go to my office to grab something. You want to come with me? And I said, absolutely. I don't want to let this guy out of my sight, right? We go to the office and we end up stopping at a gas station. My father goes into the gas station and I'm watching him in the gas station. And I start searching through the car and I open up his center console to find 2 photographs. One is of a house that I've never seen before. And the second is of his girlfriend, Sherry Campbell, with her 2 children who I knew. sitting in front of a fireplace that's covered in plastic. And I thought to myself, okay, these two things are connected and she's involved. This is something that I've never seen before. So I ended up telling Dave Messmore about this house that I found photographs of. And one of the things I'm starting to notice is during this time, like now we're into mid-January, my mother's been missing for like 15 days, 16 days, is my father is coming home, and instead of his demeanor being this angry, this apoplectic, this abusive person that he was, he's very passive. I was playing a video game called Double Dragon on my Nintendo I got for Christmas that year, and he was upset because it was a violent game. And I was like, this is a guy who used to call me a little pussy for covering my eyes when there was a violent scene in a movie. And now all of a sudden you're upset because I'm playing a violent video game? It's not even that violent, it's a game. And his whole demeanor changed, and it seemed like he was getting more and more under duress because every night Dave Messmore was coming to the house, right? And so it was around the 19th, 20th, 21st maybe of January. My father says to me, he goes, we have dinner again, the whole whodunit, where's she at sort of charade. And my father says to me, Bumper, I know it's been really hard being that mommy's left us in such a state. And I know it's been really hard for you. I think we should do a father and son trip together. I have a medical conference that's coming up in Florida in a couple of days. And I think we can go down there, just you and I, and we'll go down there. Take your mind off of mommy and everything. We'll have a nice time and we'll go to this medical conference. Now, I remember when medical conferences in Florida were, because we would go every year and they would be around spring break, not 3 weeks after Christmas, because that way it coincides with spring break and go to Busch Gardens and all these fun things, right? And I remember thinking to myself, okay, I've known how to swim since I was 5 years old. I am going to drown in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm terrified. The next day I call Dave and I say, look, Dave, I said, he wants to take me to Florida and I'm not coming back. And Dave was pretty concerned.
Wow. This story is probably one of the most powerful I've ever shared on the Daily Helping, and I am amazed at Collier's bravery as a child. There's so much more to get into this story, which we will hear in part 2. We're going to find out what happens to Collier, Dave, even Collier's dad. There's a lot left unquestioned. So thank you so much for joining us today, tuning into this episode, and we will see you back here for the conclusion of the story with part 2 with Collier Landry a week from today.